All right, cool cats and kittens. We are back to talking about Chapter 5 in criminology. So, earlier parts of Chapter 5, we discussed social disorganization theory, and then before that, we talked a little bit about the history of neighborhood levels of crime. And so today I want to move forward briefly on two additional ideas that are spin-offs of social disorganization theory, and those are differential association and culture conflict. So let's quickly go to the first one here. So what is differential association? It is basically, it's a theory um, presented to us by Edwin Sutherland, and his idea is that it's not so much about the neighborhood you live in, although that's very important, but we still have to keep focus on how people learn to become criminals. And it's not just for that, by the fact that you live in a bad neighborhood that's going to create an inclination towards criminality. It's that you interact with other people who share this same sort of approach to life, as we'll talk about here in just a second. And again, he wants to get back to the basic idea of criminology, that criminals learn to be criminals through interactions with others. Okay? So this is what moves us away from the biological theories of crime, and to some extent some of the other, many of the psychological, at least personality-based theories of crime. And it's the simple idea in sociology and social psychology that we learn to be criminals just like we learn to be many other things, many other roles in our lives. All right. So the basic idea is that the more you interact with someone with criminal values, the more likely you are to pick up on the beliefs and values and behaviors of the criminals you associate with. Okay. So to Sutherland, the idea was that throughout our lives we are exposed to different sets of definitions. And he called, to what extent he called, in terms of criminology, we are exposed to definitions that are favorable to violations of the law, and at the same time, we are exposed to definitions that are unfavorable to the violation of law. Now, in the second case here, you can probably point out lots of things in your life, or lots of times in your life where you've heard these messages, right? So, just going back to basic church behavior, you know, I mean, your church going, your Sunday school, what do you learn? The Ten Commandments, thou shalt not what? Well, there's lots of crime in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not murder. Um, so, church, the definitions you pick up going to church are clearly unfavorable to the violations of the law. So, when are you exposed to definitions that might be in favor to the violation of the law? And this is typically happens when you associate with people who who rationalize criminal acts. Okay, so for example, if you think rich people are rich because they stole from others, their riches, whether it be legitimate through legitimate opportunities or illegitimate opportunities, then you're probably not going to be, all that disinclined to believe that it's okay to steal from rich people. All right? It's sort of the Robin Hood theory. All right. Whether or not people learn to become criminals, according to Sutherland, is this weight of exposure. So, and for most of us, the weight of exposure is that the favorable definitions for good behavior are much stronger than the favorable definitions for deviant behavior. Right? So you have this huge gap, and so the weight is that we pretty much conform and behave. But not everybody does. So what about the people who do sort of break bad? So what Sutherland argues is that you learn by piecing together information from interacting with other people. So being a criminal is something you have to learn how to do it. You just can't march out the door and decide, oh, I'm going to go rob the 7-Eleven. You need a gun. You need a plan. You need, what are you going to do with the money once you've got it? What's your escape plan? Okay? And so you have to have a rationalization for breaking the law. I need money. You need the skills necessary for breaking the law. So if you decide to rob your neighbor's house and steal their stuff while they're out of town, what are you going to do with it? Okay? Do you know if they have a security system? Do you know how to beat a security system? What are the odds that those people have a mounted camera somewhere in their house? Surveillance, video surveillance. There are all these variables that go into it. And let's just say you're successful and you load up your truck with all kind of stolen goods and now I've got to get some money. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to get rid of it? You could go to a pawn shop, but pawn shops are sort of legally bound to not accept stolen property. You're going to go door to door. Hey, I got this TV. Fell off. Yeah, it fell off a truck. You want to buy it from me? I'll give you a good price. Not a good idea. As I mentioned before, probably the number one way that stuff is fenced today is through online things like Letgo or Craigslist or online platforms where the police and websites where you can sell stuff where the police just don't have the staff to monitor them. So if somebody steals your stuff, look for it on Craigslist. I mentioned this in an earlier tape. And lastly, you have to be, potential targets. You need to know. You want to pick a soft target, not a hard target. You want to pick a place where people don't have a big angry dog. You want to pick a place where they don't have video or a security guard. You want to pick a place where the neighbors across the street aren't filming their house through, their outside cameras, etc. So all of these things are behaviors you need to learn, because if you don't learn them, you're not going to be very good at it, and there's a very good chance you're going to get caught your first time out. Where do you learn these things? Well, I suppose you could get on Google and talk about it and type in how to rob a house. I suggest you try that and see what comes up. Or, you can learn through an apprenticeship. When you work with someone who's done this before, and if you build a strong relationship with that person, such that you interact with them frequently, you have a steady, long duration, a sense of trust. This relationship to you is a priority in your life, and it's an important relationship. So when we talk about crime and peer groups, one of the things we're talking about here is to what extent people's peer groups, like their friends or the people they hang out with, what are they like? Are they good people or are they bad people? Or are they a group that likes to get into trouble? And if they are a group that likes to get into trouble and you have strong relationships here, there's a very good chance you're going to learn and adapt their values and adapt their definitions of what's right or wrong, and you're going to get in trouble. Okay, so when we study gangs, you can clearly see the implication here. When we study street gangs, the idea is try to keep people out of gangs to begin with, because once they're in the gang, these types of relationships and the pressure to conform to the norms of the gang are going to lead to trouble. All right. So what Sutherland wants to point out as an important note, although I'm not sure I entirely agree with this, is that it's not just about hanging out with criminals, but you have to learn the definitions. Okay. Now he argues that you can learn definitions even from a conformist. Although again, I'm not sure I see where he's going with this idea. So what are some of the criticisms of differential association? Why do some people ignore definitions while others act upon them? It's a good criticism, and it goes back to Dr. Anderson's work on the Code of the Street, where we know that lots of good folks who live in these very bad neighborhoods don't get involved with crime. Okay? They ignore the definitions. They're just trying to get by in their lives day to day best they can. Where does the original deviance come from? Fair enough. And so it's a cause and effect thing. It's a cause and effect issue here, or what we call a problem of endogeneity. Do deviant people seek out other deviant people, or do people learn to be deviant from the people they hang out with? It's kind of like a chicken and an egg thing. Which came first, the deviant or the group the deviant hangs out with? And so clearly, I think you have to be prone to this lifestyle to begin with. Although you may not start out as a deviant, you're clearly starting out as someone who's at least inclined to hang out with these people. And you may decide, all right, this is what I want to get into. or you may decide, nah, this is not for me, because of the weight of your definitions. The definitions you've heard throughout your life is that, no, I don't care what your circumstances are, you just don't get involved with this kind of activity. You don't want to wind up in prison or dead. Whereas others, as we'll see, we're going to read a book later on this semester on the south side of Chicago, you know, they don't really see it. They don't think about it in these terms. They all just assume that they're not going to live very long, and that in terms of their definitions, whatever they do is of little consequence to them or anyone else, because their existence here, you know, they don't think about the long-term future, because they don't really think they have one. All right. And then lastly, differential association, while it's an interesting idea, it has the concepts in terms of like doing research are very hard to quantify. It's hard to sort of like figure out what these definitions are, and there's so many of them, and they vary over time, and vary by space, and vary by social group, that it doesn't really tend to work out as a very effective means of doing research. All right, differential association has policy implications. So three things here. One is that try and teach people, particularly young people, favorable definitions. You know, the schools and our role models, et cetera, are asked to pick that up. Try to give people positive role models in their lives. As in Dr. Anderson's book, we saw where people who live in, there are people who serve as role models in the neighborhoods. He talked about, I think, you know, the term he used was the good daddy, was one of the roles. And teach people that legal behavior is favorable. Okay? Now, here's what I think is interesting about social differential association, and this is why I've mentioned this, is that when you combine the idea of a socially disorganized neighborhood with the idea that you have, from social disorganization theory, with the idea that you have to learn how to become a criminal from differential association theory, when you put these two together, you have something to work with here. Because in disorganized neighborhoods, you're going to be exposed to a lot more ideas. The more you interact with people who also live in those neighborhoods, you're going to be exposed to ideas of deviance and deviant, you know, people who do bad things, and to their rationales for doing bad things, and also for their expertise in doing bad things. Again, you need to learn how to become a criminal. The greater exposure you have in these neighborhoods, you'll also have greater exposure to what we call unfavorable definitions. In other words, definitions that justify criminal activity. And that leads to being a criminal. Last thing we'll talk about here, just briefly, a couple of slides, is culture conflict theory. And so this is Thorsten Zellen. This is his theory. And so it's I think it's timely given where we are as a society. And he starts with the idea that we belong to groups that hold different conduct norms. Okay. What happens is that crime, and let's just say crime may be a rough word, or maybe deviance would be better, results from different conduct norms coming into conflict. So what Zellen was trying to study is the conflict of street gangs and how their norms and values differed significantly from mainstream society. But I think, and we'll talk about that, but I think that one of the ideas we can bring into, in terms of discussing today's social issues, is to what extent culture conflict leads to deviance in terms of social participation. And so that's what I mean here. So we have two types of culture conflict. We have primary conflict, and this happens when norms of two cultures clash. And then we have secondary conflict, and this is when a culture fragments into subcultures that each have their own norms. And I think right now where we are as a society, if we take a look at secondary conflict, it can help to explain the rise of certain social groups that, regardless of your politics, you would argue that their behavior, approach to things, is outside of the realm of normal behavior, and that we would consider it a form of deviance. I'm not saying it's criminal, I just said it's deviant. All right, so let's take skip down here to explains revolutionary behavior that society defines as deviant. This is one of his influences, Sellin's influences. So the basic argument here is that criminals or deviants are not engaging in bad behavior. They think they're engaging in behavior that they believe in. And so that gets into the role of explaining revolutionary type movements, such as Occupy Wall Street. Whereas you might thought Occupy Wall Street was, okay, yeah, it's all these people marching and taking over, walking off streets and taking over stuff, but they're exercising, they're protesting. Well, yeah, they're protesting, and they're normally doing it in a way that is within the bounds of the law. But in terms of society, in terms of the norms of society, it's different. We don't, what I mean by that, I don't mean it's a bad thing, but I mean the protests we see are different in that we don't see them every single day of our lives. Okay. In that respect, when we see one, so whenever I see a protest on the news, I'm like, oh wow, this is cool. The sociologists and these thinking, all right, we'll see something here. And the people who are protesting are being perfectly legal, but they are being a little bit deviant in the sense that they're acting out in a way that is not something we see every single day. It is not normal. It's not like, people driving to work every day. So we saw in the BLM movement after the killing in the summer of 2020, the killings, plural, unfortunately, in the summer of 2020, and some of the protests were perfectly legal. Some of the ways in which it were done were probably a little bit dangerous. So, for example, I saw a group blocking off an expressway in Atlanta, and that's dangerous because people are driving very fast, and you've got people out there marching, and you're encouraging other people to come out there and march with you. So the act of blocking off an interstate, actually technically it might be illegal to block off an interstate, but blocking off streets where traffic is in some sort of organized fashion, like you don't have the police setting up barricades to begin with, that might be considered an act of deviance, although not technically illegal in some respects, but it could be an act of deviance because of the danger that is presented to the people participating and also mixing in with fast-moving traffic. And so we saw, the rise of alt-right groups, the rise of, significant left groups like Antifa, other forms of protest. Where we see that people get out and exercise their rights, and that's fine. That's great to exercise your rights. But let's also keep in mind that because we don't see people, when we had the Open Up movement, right? So the people were trying to get the country to open up. We saw a clip of armed gunmen in Michigan with rifles taking over the state capitol. Now, in Michigan, it was perfectly legal to have those guns in that space. But as a society, we all kind of go, yeah, I'm not so sure that's normal. Having a gun in a space that, while technically legal, it isn't done every day. It isn't done by, protesters aren't showing up at state capitals every day. So that, in some ways, that makes it a sense of conflict. And there, of course, there's lots of controversy about that on the news. Again, the same thing can be applied to the protesters in the George Floyd murder, where they took to the streets and occupied streets in ways that we don't see done every day. And then we got into the rioting and the looting, which was done by not particularly people of the group, but frankly, as I would like to call professional criminals who just seized an opportunity. That's clearly an act of deviance. And in some cases, some of these were instigated by people who were not members of the group. So we saw in the burning of the Wendy's in Atlanta that it was started by, they believe to be someone associated with one of the alt-right groups to try and draw more attention to the breakdown of law and order in the city of Atlanta. A lot of conspiracy theories out there. I'm not going to promote any as absolute fact. But what I want you to understand about this is that from Zellin's work about group conflict, we can talk about how we've fractured into subcultures in our country. And here are examples on the screen right here of some of these subcultures. And it's not that people are doing it to be bad. People are doing something that they absolutely believe in. Okay? The people who wanted the country open up and showed up there with the shotguns and the AR-15s, they fully believe in their Second Amendment rights to carry these weapons wherever. The people who participate in Antifa or the people who participate in the BLM protests fully believe in their right to march on important social issues. Um, it's just that we call it deviance not because the behavior is bad or illegal, but because it's just not something we see every day, and then therefore is not really what we consider to be normal. It's not the same behavior as like, oh, I get in the car, drive to work. Traffic patterns are normal. People marching on the interstate in a protest of a violent murder, while rightfully doing so, it's still a little bit deviant in the sense that it's not something we see every single day. All right, we are done with this chapter.